Beneath the shroud of terror's endless smog, there once stood a sanctuary no longer visited. Its stones were weathered by centuries of uncertain faith, its walls echoing only the murmurs of a dwindling congregation. This place was known as the Church of the Lightning Stone, the last of its kind upon the cradle world of humanity. Every other house of worship had already been swept away by decree, dismantled brick by brick under the gaze of the Emperor's vision for mankind. Only here did the ancient rites linger, a final ember of belief smouldering against the cold advance of the new order. Within those walls, the weight of history pressed heavily. Generations had sought comfort here, their voices carried in hymns long forgotten by the wider world. Yet outside, legions of soldiers prepared to erase this final trace of devotion. Promulgators had already scoured terror with their words, weaving reason into every district, condemning the gods as fabrications of fear and ignorance. No faith endured beyond this threshold. The sanctuary became a tomb waiting to be sealed. When the Emperor came to that place, he did not wear the raiment of conquest. He walked as a man cloaked in simple form, his presence concealed in the guise of one named Revelation. He spoke with the priest within, words sharp as blades, cutting into centuries of tradition. Each claim was precise, forged in reason, and the memory of countless wars waged in the name of faith. He recited the litany of blood spilled for gods, the betrayals born of zealotry, the stagnation imposed by clerics who feared discovery. His argument was relentless. Politics, he said, had slain thousands, but religion had slain millions. The old priest trembled beneath the weight of truth delivered without cruelty, yet with inexorable force. In that exchange, humanity's past was laid bare. Every crusade and inquisition was invoked as evidence of the folly of worship. Every shrine raised in defiance of science was named as a scar upon the human spirit. The Emperor's voice carried not hatred, but judgment, as though he spoke for the very stones of terror that had endured all the wars of man. He demanded not submission, but awakening, a casting off of illusions that had crippled human progress for millennia. He declared that only through reason, only through the Imperial Truth, could mankind claim its destiny among the stars. The priest resisted, clinging to the consolation faith had always offered to the dying and the hopeless. He spoke of comfort, of belonging, of the human need for meaning. Yet the Emperor countered that consolation was no proof of truth, and that belief had chained humanity more effectively than any tyrant's hand. He painted a vision of a future where men and women stood unbound, where no unseen power could claim their allegiance, where only knowledge would chart their path forward. The air within the church grew heavy with finality, as though the stones themselves listened to the last debate they would ever hold. When at last the Emperor revealed himself, the old priest faltered. He had spoken to the master of mankind, the architect of the Great Crusade, the figure upon whose shoulders rested the fate of humanity entire. Yet no triumph followed that revelation. There was only resignation. The priest admitted that the age of faith had ended. With quiet steps, he walked from the sanctuary into the waiting guns of the Imperial Guard, offering his life in testament to what he had served. Fire consumed the church behind him, its spire collapsing into ruin, the smoke rising like a requiem over terror. Thus, the last church of mankind was extinguished. No bells tolled, no prayers endured. Only silence remained, broken by the Emperor's departing words. "Come, we have a galaxy to conquer." In that silence lay the death of one age and the birth of another, the final severing of humanity from its ancient gods. Faith had been buried in fire, and reason would march across the stars at the point of a spear. From the ruins of terror's last sanctuary arose a creed without gods. It carried no incense, no relics, no prayers. It bore a single name that would echo across entire sectors: the Imperial Truth. This doctrine became the spine of the Great Crusade, carried in the mouths of iterators, etched into the sermons of remembrancers, and enforced with the steel of compliance fleets. Where temples had once lifted towers to the sky, the banners of reason now flew. Where priests had presided, the Emperor's chosen emissaries stood with words stripped of mysticism and sharpened into declarations. The Imperial Truth was simple in design, yet vast in implication. It proclaimed that no gods existed, that no afterlife awaited, that mankind stood alone upon the galactic stage. Humanity required no divine patrons, no eternal arbiters. Survival would depend upon unity, knowledge, and strength. For some, the word struck like liberation. Whole populations, long burdened by fractured cults and feuding sects, found release in the clarity of secular command. To others, it arrived like a blade drawn across their identity. Millennia of devotion burned away in a single proclamation. Faiths that had survived dark ages and tyrants vanished under the tread of imperial boots. This doctrine did not remain as ink on a page. It moved as living speech. Iterators such as Kirill Sinderman embodied its purpose, delivering orations to conquered worlds, persuading crowds with eloquence rather than threat. They explained the futility of worship, the dangers of belief, the promise of reason. Yet persuasion alone was never the whole of it. For every world that bent willingly to the secular creed, another held fast to its pantheon, its rituals, its vision of divinity. Those worlds did not survive long as they had been. Temples collapsed in fire. Idols shattered under artillery fire. Populations were given the choice to abandon their gods or share their fate. The Imperial Truth became not only a philosophy, but an empire's law. Within this law lay ambition beyond the visible. The Emperor understood what few could see, that gods in this galaxy were not harmless phantoms, but predators in the warp, feeding upon belief, shaping themselves from devotion. Every shrine raised to a false power was a gate left ajar for demonic corruption. The eradication of faith was not simply the cleansing of superstition, but a shield against the claws of chaos. Yet this deeper reasoning was never spoken openly to the masses. To reveal the existence of the warp's entities would have been to empower them further, to turn denial into fascination, and fascination into prayer. Thus, the Imperial Truth advanced in silence, purging belief, while concealing the darker truth of why it had to die. The paradox resided in the Emperor himself. He moved as a figure who embodied more than mortal authority, his presence often described in awe, his deeds surpassing comprehension. To those who beheld him, the denial of divinity seemed hollow, for here was a being who commanded the loyalty of entire legions, whose very will could shatter armies. Yet he rejected all reverence, crushing every attempt to deify him. His refusal was uncompromising. Even whispers of worship were treated as betrayal. The Lectitio Divinitatus, a hidden text proclaiming his godhood, spread like a forbidden ember in the shadows, carried by hands willing to risk death to keep it alive. And so the Imperial Truth became a blade with two edges. On one side, it sought to unify, to protect, to free humanity from shackles that had enslaved them for untold generations. On the other, it cut into the marrow of cultures, erasing traditions that had defined entire peoples. Every compliance became an echo of Terra's last church, another pyre where gods were consigned to ash. The galaxy itself grew haunted by silence, where faith had once thundered. Yet in that silence, the seeds of defiance germinated. Faith did not vanish. It only retreated, patient as ever, waiting for the moment when denial itself might become the spark of heresy. When the fleets of the Great Crusade set out across the void, they carried more than warriors and war machines. They bore a mandate to unmake the spiritual inheritance of every rediscovered world. Compliance was never simply a matter of surrendering armies or ceding governance. It demanded the renunciation of gods, the demolition of sanctuaries, the silencing of priesthoods. To be counted among the Imperium was to step into a new age without shrines or miracles, bound instead by reason and secular law. On countless worlds, resistance to this demand proved fiercer than resistance to military conquest. Populations that could endure orbital bombardment bent their knees not from fear of annihilation, but from fear of a world without the gods that had defined them. In the heat of these confrontations, temples cracked and idols fell, toppled by Astartes whose armor shone with imperial sigils. Flame washed through reliquaries that had stood for centuries. Dust rose where once choirs had lifted voices in praise. Entire civilizations felt their history extinguished in a single night, replaced with a creed few understood, but all were forced to accept. Some iterators stood before the ruins, delivering words of promise, that this was liberation, that humanity would prosper once illusions were gone. For those who listened, the words rang hollow against the grief of a culture erased. Families wept over sacred texts reduced to ash, while imperial officers declared the act necessary for survival. The Imperial Truth arrived as salvation proclaimed through fire, and compliance was written into the rubble. Speculation lingers in the silences between those events. Perhaps tolerance could have served as well. Perhaps the Emperor might have allowed belief to wither naturally under the triumph of reason, rather than be cut down by decree. A slower path might have allowed loyalty to grow without resentment, faith to erode without martyrdom. Yet the Emperor chose swiftness. He pursued an empire free of gods, with the urgency of one who understood that hesitation would mean doom. The warp did not sleep, and every day of delay meant more prayers whispered into the ears of predators. On some worlds, memory of those purges never faded. Stories passed down in secret of how the legions burned sacred halls. The Imperial Truth stood over them as law, but beneath the surface lay resentment that smoldered for generations. To destroy a god in name was not to erase the need that birthed it. Humanity's hunger for faith remained. Every act of suppression pressed it deeper, compacting it into silence where it grew dense and unyielding. The surface was clear, but beneath it pulsed a current that could never be extinguished by decree alone. Every compliance became both victory and seed of contradiction. The galaxy bent before the Emperor's will, temples became rubble, priesthoods were scattered. Yet with every god erased, the echo of belief travelled elsewhere, into hidden gatherings, into whispered prayers, into texts smuggled aboard void ships. And when the Emperor turned his gaze to other conquests, those seeds waited, buried but alive. Among all the legions that marched beneath the imperial banner, none embodied the contradiction of faith and denial more deeply than the word-bearers. From their inception, they viewed devotion as strength, prayer as mortar that bound warriors together, worship as the highest expression of loyalty. They built temples on compliant worlds, raised monuments not to forgotten idols but to the Emperor himself. They called him divine, even as he forbade it. To them, reverence was not betrayal, but perfection of service. The clash could not remain hidden. For years their faith spread quietly, their monuments rising in shadowed corners of conquered realms. But silence broke at Monarchia. There, the word-bearers had raised a city so devoted, so radiant in its sanctity, that it could not escape notice. Monarchia stood as proof of their creed, a cathedral world to the Emperor's glory. When he discovered it, his fury fell like judgment. He summoned Guilliman and the Ultramarines to dismantle the city stone by stone, while the word-bearers were forced to kneel in shame, their Primarch humiliated before the eyes of his sons. That day burned into the marrow of the 17th Legion. For lORE, it was not merely rebuke, it was betrayal. He had given worship to a father who demanded obedience yet rejected love. He had offered devotion and was met with scorn. The destruction of Monarchia seared a wound into the soul of the Legion, one that festered into bitterness and thirst for forbidden truths. From that moment, their loyalty was fractured, their faith driven underground, redirected not toward the Emperor, but toward powers waiting hungrily in the Imperium. Speculation rises from the ashes of Monarchia. If the Emperor had accepted even a fraction of their devotion, might the heresy have been delayed, perhaps even averted? Had he allowed the word-bearers to build their temples as symbols of unity rather than threats of idolatry, would they have remained steadfast? Or was the wound inevitable? For no creed of worship could coexist with his vision of secular empire. Some historians whisper that Monarchia was not only punishment but theatre, that the Emperor sought to warn every legion, every world, that no faith would be tolerated, no matter how loyal its object. In that reading, the city's destruction was not aimed at lORE alone, but at humanity entire, a demonstration that gods would find no soil in the Imperium. The word-bearers drew their own conclusion. To them, the Emperor's rejection proved fear, not strength. They declared that he denied his divinity because greater gods existed, and he could not abide rivals. They sought out those rivals, and the warp answered. Monarchia's ruins thus became the birthplace of treachery, the point where devotion twisted into heresy, where love soured into vengeance. The wound never closed. It widened into the rift that tore the galaxy apart. Even as the Emperor forbade all reverence, faith did not vanish. It survived in whispers, carried like contraband through the corridors of void ships, copied into fragile manuscripts, murmured in private before the glow of shipboard candles. Among these fragments lay the Lectitio Divinitatus, a text written in secrecy that declared the Emperor to be not only master of mankind, but its god. Copies spread quietly through fleets, hidden in the satchels of remembrances and the packs of soldiers. What began as a forbidden hymn became the foundation of a cult that would one day cover the stars. The paradox became impossible to ignore. The Emperor declared himself no god, yet every gesture of his power seemed to contradict his words. He towered above mortals, shattering armies with a glance, guiding the fate of a species with the certainty of destiny. To the ordinary soldier, to the colonist kneeling in the dust of a compliant world, divinity was not a theory. It was the only language vast enough to describe what they saw. Denial from the Emperor himself only deepened the hunger, as if humanity needed to sanctify him even more fiercely in the face of his refusal. The legions carried this contradiction in silence. Within the ranks of the word-bearers, worship hardened into defiance, their prayers rising not only to the Emperor, but to darker listeners. Within other legions, murmurs spread in secret. Some captains dismissed the cult as folly. Others carried the words of the Lectitio close to their hearts. For common troops, especially those drawn from worlds where gods had always ruled, faith offered comfort in a galaxy of endless war. To fight in the name of reason alone felt cold and empty. To believe they marched behind a god gave meaning to their sacrifice. Speculation here grows heavy. Was the Lectitio a natural evolution of human longing, or did unseen hands in the warp encourage its spread? Did cults arise simply from awe, or were they stirred by entities eager to twist devotion into corruption? Perhaps both were true. Humanity's hunger for belief made it fertile soil, and where soil is rich, seeds fall easily. The Emperor may have believed suppression would be enough, but belief is not so easily silenced. It flows where it is forbidden, becoming stronger the more it is denied. The paradox widened with every campaign. Soldiers who had burned temples on distant worlds now knelt in the dark, whispering prayers to their living Emperor. Citizens stripped of ancient gods replaced them with a figure who walked among them, who could not be dismissed as myth. The very success of the Imperial Truth created the soil in which the forbidden cult grew. By erasing every other god, the Emperor left only one figure vast enough to carry the need for worship, himself. And in the hidden corners of the Imperium, that worship swelled, awaiting the moment when it would erupt into the open. The Emperor's command had been absolute: no gods, no worship, no faith. Yet as centuries unfolded, the Imperium became the greatest theocracy humanity had ever known. Temples rose higher than fortresses, cathedrals spanned the width of continents, and every world echoed with litanies to the master of mankind. Where once he had sought to silence belief, now his image dominated every shrine, his name invoked in every prayer. The paradox became the bedrock of imperial culture. The Emperor, who forbade godhood, became the God-Emperor, enthroned upon the golden throne, sustained by the very worship he despised. The transformation was not gentle. It arrived in the wake of the Horus heresy, when treachery and war tore the Imperium open and left the Emperor broken upon his throne. In the aftermath, humanity clung to him as the only constant. Faith became survival. Ecclesiarchs rose to power. The Lectitio Divinitatus shifted from forbidden tract to holy scripture, and the Imperial Cult became the unifying force of an empire scattered by war. Every shrine burned in the Great Crusade found its reflection in new sanctuaries raised to the Emperor himself. Humanity had not abandoned belief. It had simply traded one pantheon for one figure. Speculation deepens here. Was this the Emperor's failure, or was it inevitable? Did he misjudge the nature of his species, believing reason would suffice where yearning for meaning has always endured? Or did he foresee that his death in life would transform him into exactly what he feared, and press forward regardless, believing that even a false god of order was preferable to countless true gods of ruin? No answer endures. Only the evidence of the Imperium itself, vast and unshakable in its devotion, a contradiction made eternal. Across the stars, billions kneel daily before his image. They whisper prayers before battle, chant litanies over machines, carve his sigil into the armor of the faithful. The Imperial Truth lies buried beneath these rituals, a forgotten philosophy eclipsed by the iron weight of religion. Yet somewhere in the silence between shrines and in the echo of burned temples, the question lingers. Could humanity ever have endured without faith? The Emperor sought to forge a secular future, yet human nature returned to the gods, as it always has. Perhaps the war against religion was never winnable, for belief is not a structure to be torn down, but a hunger that returns in every age. Thus, the age ends as it began, in fire and contradiction. The last church on Terra lies in ruin, its stones scattered to dust, while new cathedrals reach into the void. The Emperor's refusal echoes still, even as his worship resounds louder than any hymn of old. Humanity kneels, humanity fights, humanity survives. The truth remains unresolved, but the faith endures, and the Imperium moves forward beneath banners that proclaim a god who never asked to be worshipped.